You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Well. The walk of shame. I can't believe it. I walk in here, I asked for the grand total. I said, are we over 11,700, which was my total. That's what I was supposed to raise for 3CR. And they said, no, Joe. And I said, what's the number? Well, they said $10,049.50. That's right, $10,049.50. Now, I did the mathematics before I walked in, and that means during the program I'd like to raise $1,650.50 towards the 3CR Radiothon, courtesy of the Anarchist World this week. Because 3CR is an essential part of your life. It's not just about getting a warm inner glow or being involved in the decision-making processes by being a listener sponsor. It's much more than that. It's about getting a legal, legitimate tax deduction. I just find it extraordinary that so many ordinary, working class, hard-working, church-going, mosque-going people who listen to the Anarchist World this week will not avail themselves of a legal, legitimate tax deduction. I do. So why don't you? The rich and famous do. So why don't you? Now, seriously, I need to raise $1,650.50. Hopefully we can do it this morning. That way I don't have to bother you next week. So if you could ring 94198377, 94198377. Lou will answer the phone and she'll take your details in your donation. You can text your donation to 0488 809 855, or you can do what smart people do. I don't know how to do it, but you can go to 3cr.org.au/donate. So this is your chance to keep 3CR on air for another 12 months. And just in case you've forgotten, and I'm sure you have, because most of you haven't been listening for the last 48 years, today is the day I walked into 3CR, did the first program in 1977. I could have become President of the United States of America, but I decided to stay here at 3CR. So doesn't that deserve a donation? 94198377. Ring now. Make your donation. Here we go. The sacred cows have wandered in with 5 cents. 50 cents, they said. Here we go. Welcome to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. My name's Joseph Toscano. First of all, I'd like to apologise. Yes, I know it's a bit hard apologising. But I'd like to apologise to all those listeners across the country who listened to pre-record last week. Unfortunately, 3CR had a radiothon last week. That's the studio from which I broadcast here in Melbourne. And we need to raise some money to keep our independence, to allow people like you who are listening to this program to get a different analysis. Not an alternative analysis, but a different analysis of what's going on in the world today. So we're back live on air on Anarchist World this week, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. Now, just in case you have some spare cash or you need a legal, legitimate tax deduction, the 3CR Radiothon is still ongoing. I realise you people listening at another radio station will give your pennies to your local community radio station. But if you've got some spare cash and you want to support the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network, you can always ring 039419 8377, 039419 8377 and make a donation. You can text the donation to 0488 809 855. 5, or you can go to 3cr.org.au/donate. Currently, we've raised $10,049.50, which leaves us with $1,650.50 to raise, hopefully during this hour. It's not just about a warm inner glow. It's not just about being part and parcel of a different analysis. It's about keeping community radio alive in this country. So I encourage you to donate, and most importantly of all you rich and famous listeners to the Anarchist World this week, you can get a legal, legitimate tax deduction if you donate before the 30th of June. So hopefully we will see that number rise from $10,049.50 to $11,700. Now they've got rid of all that. Anarchism, anarchos without rulers. Not without rules, without rulers. Going back to basics, what gives rulers the ability to determine the lives of hundreds of millions, if not billions of people? Inequalities in power and wealth. The anarchist struggle is the struggle to share power, possibly through direct democratic means, and the struggle to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. Ideas which are diametrically opposed to what we are seeing around the planet at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century. It's as if we're involved in a race to the bottom, to go back to the Middle Ages, to go back to the period of Genghis Khan, to go back to the period of the Black Plague. Concentration of power in fewer and fewer hands. The buffoon says something, the world reacts. Some rich geezer says something, the world reacts. You say something, nobody gives a shit. And that's the beauty of living in the land of milk and honey, the land down under. The losers in this country are hard-working, tax-paying, honest people who pay their bills, pay their taxes, do the best they can to raise the people they're responsible for. At the end of the day, they're considered to be losers. The winners, those who evade the law, use smart accountants and lawyers to find every legal, legitimate tax loophole, make a profit at the expense of other people's labour, lie, carry on, they're the winners. And that's the problem with living in a society based on a private investment for private profit mantra. Now, I've been at the Community Radio 3CR for 48 years. This is my 48th anniversary this week. I started in 1977 in a program called Encounters with the Third Alternative, which transformed to the Anarchist World this week with the fall of the Berlin Wall. I think it was in 1989. So, why 3CR? I'm a volunteer. I don't get paid. Basically, all you get is criticism. But the thing is, why? Because it allows me to give an independent analysis of what's happening in the world based on a non-authoritarian perspective. I mean, I describe myself as a postmodern anarchist. I am not crucified to the strategies of the past. Anarchism is a simple concept. It's about creating a society without rulers, not without rules. It's about looking at the fundamental structures which give a minuscule minority, as we see blatantly every minute of the day, to make decisions for hundreds of millions, if not billions of people, and escaping any consequences for those decisions. That's what community radio is about. It's about giving you an independent voice. It's different to a podcast. It's a broadcast. It's not about, talking to a little minuscule group of people with similar ideas. It's not about making money. It's about independent thought and ideas. That's what community radio is all about. And that's why for 48 years I've come into this particular radio station, done this program and a few other programs. For that very reason, for that independence. And you don't have independence in a capitalist society unless you control your finances. If you've got to rely on government grants, you're limited in what you can say. If you've got to rely on commercials, you're limited in who you can criticise. If you've got to rely on corporate donations, you may as well give up. And that's why I have, for the last 48 years, broadcast on Community Radio Network. It may be of interest to you, it may not be of interest to you. But the important thing is that it gives you and me an opportunity to look at things in a different way. Now, let's look at the concept of existential threat. The state of Israel says it is destroying lives and people and infrastructure in Lebanon and Syria and Gaza and the West Bank and Iran, and the list goes on, because it faces an existential threat. Now, I don't live in Melbourne, I live in regional Victoria. And I face an existential threat regarding brown snakes and tiger snakes. We get on. We occupy the same space. We make allowances with each other. We get on. I don't go out there and say, these tiger snakes or these brown snakes pose me an existential threat and I've got to destroy all of them. Now let's look at the state of Israel, a pariah state, a criminal state, which is run by elected, and let's not forget, elected war criminals. A state of around 10 million people. The region it finds itself in is home to about 1 billion people. So these 10 million people, or a great majority of these 10 million people, not all of them, but a significant majority, believe that the region poses an existential threat to their existence. So instead of trying to come to an accommodation with the people they dispossessed and with their neighbours, they have decided to use extreme force. Now, the bombing in Tehran and Iran, the bombing in Lebanon, in Beirut, the bombing we've seen in Yemen, the atrocities which occur on a daily basis in Gaza, where 2 million people have had almost everything that makes life bearable violently removed, where people are executed. They call it a war, I call it execution, when they're trying to get some sustenance for their families. And we in the West jump up and down regarding the existential threat to the state of Israel. What about the existential threat from the state of Israel to the 1 billion people which live around the state of Israel, a newly created sovereign nation state in 1947? Think about it. And we in the West somehow think that it's okay to kill women and children. You know, I feel sorry for many of the residents in Israel, not because they've been bombed, but I feel sorry for them because their government, they have allowed their government to make them into a pariah state. They have allowed their government to turn their young men and women into murderers. It's all very well talking about the murderers that Hamas caused, but think of the long-term consequences for those residents in Israel. There is no way any enduring peace will occur. And if the buffoon in Washington, Mr. Bufalini, the reincarnation of Mr. Mussolini, thinks that creating another Afghanistan in Iran is going to somehow solve the existential threat to the state of Israel, I think the people of the United States of America seem to have forgotten their history. They've forgotten what happened in Vietnam. They forgot what happened in Afghanistan. They forgot what happened in Iraq. And the list goes on and on. So let's see. You and I can do very little. We can contact our politicians. We can protest. But we're not in a position to violently react to what's occurring. But I think it's important that as a species, as people in this country, that we begin to respect the essence of life, very life itself, because the tragedy, the obscenities that are occurring in Gaza and to a lesser extent in the West Bank highlight to what extent the Israeli state will go in order to protect itself against its so-called existential threat. Now, I know there's a lot of noise about Iran trying to, develop a nuclear bomb, and the G7 says they will never be allowed to declare a nuclear bomb. But let's not forget, the Israeli state has over 200 nuclear bombs. And considering what they've been allowed by us and the rest of the world to do in Gaza, it doesn't take much, thinking to realise that they would be very happy to use a nuclear bomb if they felt threatened. So I said before, I could go out there in my little, 5-acre block and try to kill all the tiger snakes and the brown snakes, put out baits, do it all. But it's not going to solve that existential threat. There are snakes that'll come in outside the property. It's the same for Israel. And as long as the Israeli people continue to elect governments who think that the only way they can exist in that part of the world is through extreme violence, well, nothing. They will never have 1 minute of peace or security. You're listening to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Now, I want you to stay with me because we're going to move from this to productivity. Now, I notice that the incoming Labor government, which has got quite a lovely little majority in the House of Representatives, and a majority when it teams up for the Greens in the Senate, has one very important thing it wants to do. And it's going to hold a conference, which you and I won't be invited to, obviously, because we've got nothing to offer, have we? About productivity. You like the word? Productivity. We need to increase productivity in this country. We need to make more with less or make more with more. I'm not sure what they're talking about. You see, productivity in a capitalist society, one based on private investment for private profit, isn't just based on the amount of work you do as an employee or the amount of work you do as a small business person. All right? Productivity in an economy which is dominated by corporations is not only dependent on the individual worker, but dependent on the owner of the business investing in the business. Labour-saving devices, other devices, you need to invest in the business. Now, the problem is, in Australia, we have a taxation system which actually, it's hard to believe, which actually does not reward corporations for investing in their business and increasing productivity, because we have a thing called a franking credit. Now, just stay with me. Now, obviously, most of you, like me, are not shareholders, or if you are a shareholder, you're a shareholder accidentally because of, your superannuation funds. All right. So let's look at this. You buy a share. Whippy-doo, you buy a share. You make money in three ways. Well, you can lose money, but if you're going to make money, you make money in three ways. The share increases in value. For example, when the Commonwealth Bank was privatised by a previous Labor government in the 1980s, I think the share sold for around $5. Today, a Commonwealth Bank share, grossly overpriced, is $280. So you're going to from $5 to $280. So you've made some money, right? Obviously, you paid a little bit of taxation. 24% is the maximum. If you realise, you have what's called a realised gain. What that means is you sell your share and you go, whoopie-doo, I've made a beauty of a profit because some idiot in the past privatised an important element, in our financial sector. Then if you own a share, you can get a dividend. A dividend is when the company makes a profit and at the end of the year gives you so much for every share you own. For example, you get a dividend of 80 cents a share, $2 a share, 2 cents a share. And then you have this wonderful thing, which is a particularly Australian thing called a franking credit. Now, if the company that you've got that share with pays its tax, and obviously in the majority of cases, that tax is grossly underestimated because of this country's corporation-friendly taxation laws, pays its tax, you gain what's called a franking credit. So that means that you don't have to pay tax on that dividend, that profit you've made. So what that means is corporations keen to keep their investors happy will pay dividends and franking credits. So instead of reinvesting profits in the business and increasing productivity, because you can't expect people to increase productivity the same boring 19th century, machinery, that profit goes to the shareholder. So if we're going to talk about productivity, it's not about squeezing individual workers. It's about changing the system in such a way that corporations and businesses are forced to reinvest in their business, not actually waste money rewarding their shareholders. Listen to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network.
You're listening to a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned to hear the rest of your 3CR podcast.
Let's move on. Now, I used to be very good at maths, but, not that good anymore. And to me, 2050 does not equal 2070, does it? There's what? 20, number 20 missing there, isn't it? Well, why am I using these esoteric language? Well, not because you listen to the Anarchist World this week, courtesy of the Community Radio Network, but I'm using this esoteric language to talk about a little thing that happened last week, which was the news last week, but with the buffoon jumping up and down, it's tend to slip away from our attention. And that's the problem of the 24-hour news cycle, isn't it? Something pops up and then something disappears. Then something pops up and something disappears. And that's why nothing ever changes. Well, we're supposed to be carbon neutral by 2050, okay? Carbon neutral. 2050. Even the National Party, that agribusiness apologist, corporate agribusiness apologist, talks about 2050. Well, they're not happy about it. But Woodside Petroleum has just been given an extension to continue to produce gas in the northwest, Australia, to the year 2070. Now, I'm not going to talk about the 65,000-year-old petroglyphs or carvings, a million of them, which, people talk about being destroyed. I mean, we don't care about our past, do we? As long as there's a buck to be made, maybe we should crush it up and, send it to the USA. But that's a different story. But why would you give Woodside special consideration to 2070 if it is the goal of this country to be carbon neutral by 2050? So obviously it's just lip service to the idea of Australia being carbon neutral by 2050. Otherwise, they would have extended Woodside's monopoly, or duopoly. It's a duopoly, there's Woodside and Santos, as far as gas is concerned. You would think it'd be extended to 2050, not 2070. And then you've got the other little problem on the horizon, the Abu Dhabi government, which is looking for a way to be relevant after 2050, wants to buy Santos and has valued the company, which, gas extraction is its main, aim in life, at around $30 billion, which may seem a lot of money to you, but to some people it's nothing, right? $30 billion. Now, the board of Santos has agreed to this little takeover, but guess what? Guess what, boys and girls? The Treasurer, in his wisdom, may actually abort a takeover. It's ridiculous. A country as big as Australia, extraordinary amount of gas, can't even supply the East Coast. 2 corporations dominate gas extraction. What can I say? What can I say? You're listening to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Let's move on. You remember, those of you who are old enough to remember Lyndon Johnson when he came to Australia, I think it was 1964, the President of the U.S.A. There was hysteria in the streets, apart from a few mouths who tried to stop the cavalcade, but that was 1964. And the slogan we had in 64 before we entered the Vietnam War, while we were entering the Vietnam War, was all the way with LBJ, all the way with the USA. Well, I think 50 years later, should be changing that slogan to F.off U.S.A. It sounds terrible, doesn't it? F.off U.S.A. Now, I know a lot of people are concerned about what's happening in the USA, but I'm not. Like the people of Israel, the people of the United States of America did have options, and they decided to elect a buffoon as their president, which is fair enough. They wanted to elect a buffoon, that's fine. Now, obviously, there are issues in the USA. We see it every day. But there's one very important problem for us here in the land of Oz. And I call it the land of Oz because we don't seem to be kind of able to project in the future. A big problem. We are tied to the United States of America. Tied by apron strings. Not only economically, but more important, defence-wise. We have become part and parcel of the United States military-industrial complex. And I can assure you, if the United States becomes involved, and they could be becoming involved as I speak, in an extended campaign in Iran, that their bases, not our bases, their bases on Australian soil outside Alice Springs, at Pine Gap and other parts of the country, will be instrumental in ensuring their bunker bombs go off. So we are seen by the rest of the world, whether it's Russia or China or whatever you like, as a primary ally of the United States of America. Now, obviously, the current government is a little bit hesitant in putting its foot in the water as far as the Middle East is concerned. But as I've said consistently on this program, we are dealing with a failing empire. And to have our military infrastructure completely integrated in the United States military infrastructure, and that's what the AUKUS submarine deal is about, makes us a sitting duck. And we don't have an iron dome to protect us, and we never will, because we're not that important. And the fact is that if there is interaction between China and the USA, it's highly likely that our government will side with the USA and make us a military target. That's what I've said for years. The fact that we have not developed our relationship with our neighbours. Because unlike fairyland, where we think we can attach a few tugboats to the west coast of Australia and, tug us up, that's not the right word, but take us up to the west coast of the United States of America, well, it doesn't happen that way. Australia is part and parcel of Southeast Asia. We're surrounded by sovereign nation states which are part of our region. And it's one thing to have a military alliance with Japan and South Korea because they are integrated into the USA's military alliance. But it's another thing to be involved in serious discussions and forming alliances with countries like Indonesia and Vietnam and Thailand, and the list goes on and on. And even more importantly, people talk about this battle in the Pacific among our Pacific neighbours between Australia and China, trying to prevent the Chinese government from actually having a military base or a foothold in the Pacific. And the problem is that as a country, our vision has been so myopic, especially under Liberal National Party governments, that we have totally ignored our neighbours in the Pacific. And if you ignore your neighbours, they don't care about you. It's a little bit when you move into a new place. You can ignore your neighbours and your place can burn down and people go tut-tut. Or you can interact with your neighbours. And if your place burns down, maybe they'll pull you out before you get burnt alive. And that's a dilemma. Who are our friends as a sovereign country? Who are our friends? Who are our enemies? And because somebody theoretically has been our friend for so long, does not mean they are our friends. And that's the beauty of living in Australia, isn't it? The debate about what is possible is so constrained that there is no debate. It is totally closed down. I'll give you an example. Now we saw the Israeli, those wonderful, wonderful Israeli Defence Forces, bomb the state media in Tehran. All right, okay. I found it quite amazing seeing one of their presenters come back about 2 or 3 minutes after being bombed and continue the news bulletin. I don't think any of our news people would have that type of guts, but that's a different story. I mean, and they talk about propaganda. Now, obviously, this Iranian state media is a propaganda centre for the theocracy that rules Iran, which is particularly unloved by significant sections of their population. We all accept that. Okay, that's not a problem. But bombing their headquarters is a little bit akin to the China bombing Sky News. Same thing. What are they? Nothing more than a propaganda outlet for the Trump-led United States government. Because something is privately owned and something is owned by the state, somehow makes it impervious to criticism. Now we know, to a significant degree, the buffoon in Washington was elected because of the efforts over decades of Fox Media. They don't care who's President of the United States of America. They don't care. What they care about is the amount of profit they're going to make. And the fact is that the Fox News outlet is nothing more than a propaganda outlet equivalent to the propaganda outlet of the state-owned media in Iran. No different. It's just a propaganda outlet. Extraordinary. But do you hear people talk in that fashion in this country? No. You've got to, everything you say is constrained. It's constrained, You've got to work within the envelope. I mean, let's look at the situation regarding First Nations people. I know you're bored. You've heard it before. Let's look at the situation regarding deaths in custody, approaching 600 since the Royal Commission during the Hawke Labor government. Now, we saw a young woman being beaten to death by the morality police in Iran. And we saw 12 months of protests. 12 months of protests. We see another Indigenous person dying in custody. We see a little bit of protest from the Indigenous community and their supporters, and it disappears out of sight. We don't see a concerted effort. As far as the privately owned mass media was concerned in this country, it was a non-event. Just extraordinary. And that's the dilemma. If you've face the same garbage every day, the same analysis every day, you will tend to think in that fashion. I'll give you another example. Now, I mentioned this, I think, at the beginning of the program. You know, you're a loser, I'm a loser. I'll tell you why we're losers. Not because I'm broadcasting community radio, that makes me a winner. And not because you're not donating to your local community radio station to keep it on air for another 12 months and keep it independent, that makes you a big winner. But we're losers for one very good reason, because we're honest people. We pay our taxes. We work hard. We try to look after our families and the people we're responsible for. In the majority of cases, we obey the law, okay? And what do you get? Nothing. People say, what about superannuation? Well, boys and girls, what a con. The more you earn in life, the bigger your retirement balance. And the better life you will lead when you're retired, and the better little nursing home you'll go to when you're no longer able to look after yourself. But if you are not paid part of the paid workforce because you have a disability, because you've spent a lot of your time looking after your children, because you're in a low-paid part-time job, by the time you retire at the grand old age of 67, you find that you're paying for your own pension. What an extraordinary situation you find yourself in. But do we have debates about that? Do we have debates about the fact that the superannuation system is a system which entrenches inequality over a lifetime? No. What's been the big debate in Australia over the last few months? That people with more than $3 million in their superannuation account may have to pay for unrealised gains on their investment. Now, if you've got more than $3 million in your bloody superannuation account and you don't want to pay the new tax, you take the bloody money out and you invest it in something else. Even an idiot like me knows that. And what's the debate? That 2 to 3% of Australians' life is going to be ruined. Ruined. What a pathetic situation you and I find ourselves in. I'll give you another example. It's winter. Now, every winter, we will be inundated with hard luck stories about how people are homeless, how people are couch surfing, how 3 million Australians don't actually have enough money for food. And the list goes on and on. Now, every word I've spoken is 100% true. 100% true. Winter is horrible for people who haven't got a roof over their heads. It's a horrible time, especially currently for the amount of respiratory infections which are around the community. COVID, influenza, RSV, and the list goes on and on. Upper respiratory tract infections. It's a horrible time. But why do we have the same story year after year after year after year after year? Why do we rely on private charities who I've got no criticism about having to do the heavy lifting in order to provide basic necessities for people who find themselves in this situation? Why does nothing ever seem to change? Is there a debate about that? No. Let's look at the public housing debacle. It is a debacle. Now today, most listeners to the program would know the difference between public housing, affordable housing, community housing, social housing, you name it, right? But unfortunately, because of deft government propaganda and propaganda from the private sector, People have no idea. No idea. 99% of people outside, say listeners to a community radio station, have no idea about the difference. They think it's the same thing. Well, it's not. Public housing is owned and managed by the government of the day, usually state housing. Community housing, affordable housing, social housing, whatever you like to call it, is private housing. They're owned by charities or corporations that are in to make a buck. The mechanisms that are used to decide who accesses public housing and who accesses community housing are totally different. One's based on need, the other supposedly is based on need, but theoretically isn't, and practically isn't. And I'm hoping in the next few weeks to have a member of community housing come on to the Radical Australia, which is another program I do on Community Radio 3CR, to talk about their experience. And the trouble is, people who find themselves in this situation are fearful of being blacklisted. Fearful. Where's that debate? People say to me, where are all the people in community housing? You know, where are all the people in public housing? Why aren't they protesting? Well, it's very simple. I'll tell you why. Because they're shit scared about losing their accommodation if they put their head above the parapets, and then being, in the majority of cases, on social security benefits, they will join the homeless. Men, women, children. They will join the homeless. So why do we have this constant debate? Constant debate regarding homelessness, and nothing ever seems to be done about it. I personally know somebody who's been living on the foreshores down in the Mornington Peninsula, I think for about 8 years, trying to get into some type of housing with no success. Middle-aged woman. Extraordinary. And I'm sure all of you know of similar situations. I mean, I used to keep saying that we don't live in Bangladesh, all right? My apologies to the people of Bangladesh. But the thing is, and this is why we're losers, you know, you and me, we're losers. This is a resource-rich country. Not one human being, irrespective of the problems they face, whether they're psychiatric issues, whether they're social issues, whether because of problems, you know, childhood problems, should be living in that situation in this country. Not one. But we find ourselves in that situation. Let's look at the housing issue. Now, we have the most expensive, I think it's the second most expensive housing in the world. All right? Now, today, if your parents die, in some cases, not all cases, you'd be lucky to inherit the bloody mortgage in the will. Intergenerational mortgages. Very common problem in Japan, but hasn't been here for a while yet. Intergenerational mortgages. So why are people paid 30, 40, 50, and in a few cases 60 to 70% of their income to keep a roof over their head by renting property or by trying to pay off a mortgage? Well, it's simple. We have totally privatised the public. We have totally privatised housing. It's about private investment for private profit. There is no strong public housing sector. As I keep saying, in a capitalist economy, you need competition I mean, we've reached the ridiculous situation in this country where we have the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission to ensure corporations compete amongst each other. How ridiculous. It's the end point of capitalism, is the creation of corporations, right? So in Australia in 2025, we're a corporate-based society. I mean, we hear people in small business being constantly squeezed. This is, again, how the debate is constrained, right? Now, obviously, people in small business are constantly constrained and squeezed. Not just by government charges, not just by the money they need to pay their employees, not just the rent they need to pay, to landlords and landwomen who own property, but because of the economy of scale. You know what that means is the bigger you are, the less competition. I know hotels, right? Small hotels around this country, and this you find this extraordinary. Where do they go to buy their liquor? Dan Murphy's. Did you imagine that? I know many restaurants. Where do they go to buy their ingredients? Coles and Woolworths. So how can you expect small business to compete? At least in many European countries, those of us who are fortunate enough to travel, we go to Europe and we go, oh, wasn't it wonderful in Italy? There are all these little shops and they've been there for generations. Well, they have bloody laws. They have laws in place which prevent large corporations from setting up shopping metropolises near these strip shopping centres. We don't. We allow the corporate sector to do what they like. That's Australia, 2025. If you're a corporation, you're too big to fail. I'll give you another example, and this is the example I find the most obscene. I mean, I don't mind being a loser. I don't mind paying my taxes. I don't mind obeying the law. I don't mind being a good little boy and paying my bills. I don't mind, being screwed up, by the financial sector. All right, that's my burden, right? But I do mind when governments forget who they supposedly represent. See, we've had an election. You should all be happy. But it doesn't work that way. Because we live in a country which likes to think itself democratic, which likes to think itself fair, which likes to think that it is the bastion of the fair go. But the reality is we're a bunch of idiots. And I'll tell you why I'm an idiot. I'll just call myself an idiot. Because I've been on the planet almost 74 bloody years. I was born in this country. I've been an activist since I was 16 or 17, right? And what I've seen over the last, 55 years is increase in corporate power, decrease in the power exercised by governments we theoretically elect every 3 to 4 years. And to a major degree, it's our fault. It's all very well to, blame the government, but we're supposedly a democratic society. Well, representative democracy anyway. And in many ways, we deserve the governments we get. Because we've been blinded as a people by the private investment for private profit mantra. That somehow thinking that being part of a cooperative or a collective is some type of retrograde step, by allowing the state to institute and develop public institutions to look after the basic needs of people in this country is somehow, some type of communist revolution. So in many regards, like the people of Israel, like the people of the United States of America, we get the governments we deserve. We can't say that, like China, where people don't get that opportunity to elect their representatives, that somehow we're different. We're not. Because we have allowed the institutions which create the laws in this country to be dominated by the interests of the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, because we think one day we will get pie in the sky. Am I cynical? No. If I was cynical, I wouldn't have spent 48 years on community radio. You know, I'm not cynical. I know that things change. That is the nature of human history. We've seen extraordinary changes to assist people in this country, like Medicare, National Disability Insurance Scheme, Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, and the list goes on and on. But we can do much better if we controlled our resources, instead of allowing private corporations to make massive profits at our expense. You've been listening to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Those of you that are listening to this program on the 18th of June 2025 in the city of Melbourne, I'll be doing a presentation on privatisation and mutual aid societies in Australia, historically, in Australia at the Footscray Hotel at 48 Hopkins Street this evening. The talk starts at 7 p.m. If people get there at 6:30 p.m, you can just mix and meet other like-minded people. So come along. Now, if you are listening to this program and you love your community radio station and you like community radio stations to keep going, I suggest you contact your local community radio station and volunteer. They're always looking for volunteers to help. And if you can't volunteer and you've got a bit of spare money, why don't you donate? And if you're listening to this program via Community Radio 3CR, we're in the middle of a radiothon. I'm trying to raise $11,700. I'm about $1,650 short. So give us a ring, 039 419 8377, 039 419 8377. Text us on 0488 809 855 or donate at 3cr.org.au. And don't forget, every donation, if you pay tax, is tax deductible. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of Community Radio 3CR. Web pages, anarchistmedia.org, pibci.net. You can join by downloading the application form, pibci.net, public interest before corporate interest. YouTube channels, public interest before corporate interest, josephtoscano.nar. You can leave messages on 0439 395 489. You can go to the historical channel I set up, josephtoscano.nar. And the list goes on and on. But ultimately, change comes when enough people believe that change is critical. We can continue to carry on as we are, or we can become part of a wider movement to initiate change. Charity helps a few. Fundamental legislative changes helps many more. Radical extra-parliamentary change has the potential to make a profound difference to many people's lives. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. As I said before, listen in to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station next week. My name's Joseph Toscano. You've been listening to The Anarchist World this week, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. I wonder what's happening. Here I am, stuck in a studio. 11 o'clock has come round. I'm still talking. I don't know if you're listening. Who knows what's going on? But that's the nature of broadcasting. You're broadcasting to a lot of people at the same time on the Community Radio Network. Here we go. All right. Now, what are we going to talk about next week? Well, who knows what will happen in the next few days. Who knows how the world will change? Who knows what the buffoon will do? Who knows how the world will respond? You never know your luck in a big city, as they say. All right.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.